Welcome everyone to a webinar series on the long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. My name is Pablo Carvajal from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. This webinar series is organized as one of the activities under a clean energy ministerial campaign on the long-term energy scenarios. It is aimed at promoting the wider adoption and improved use of long-term energy scenarios in guiding a long-term transition to clean energy. The campaign addresses three interrelated themes. The first one is about the use of scenarios in the political process, guiding towards clean energy transition. The second theme is about improving scenarios and modeling tools to reflect emerging factors relevant for the transition. And the third and last theme is approach to build capacity in the government sector for scenario building. Today we have two speakers, both of them from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center here in Bonn. Daniel Russo, who will be speaking about the AVER project addressing the variable renewables in long-term planning, and Emanuele Taibi, who will be talking about power system flexibility for the energy transition. Each speaker has 20 minutes, 15 minutes for presentation and 5 minutes for questions and answers. This webinar will be recorded and shared through the IRENA webpage. Before we begin, I will briefly introduce how to operate the webinar interface. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. If you have a question, please send your questions to us using the question feature on the webinar panel. Questions can be only reviewed by us and not shared with the audience. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our panelists at the end. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered by the end of the session. If you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. You may also download the presentation slides in PDF in the handout section. If your technical difficulties remain unresolved, you may write to us through the questions section. We will try to help you. Thank you very much. So we welcome now our first speaker, Daniel Russo.
Hi, Pablo. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for listening in. So like you mentioned, Pablo, the first presentation today that I'll be giving is on key technical considerations for variable renewable energy in long-term planning. And so to clarify, before we get started, the focus here is very much on the long-term energy scenarios campaign. So that means taking a long-term perspective on the planning of variable renewable energy like wind and solar PV. There are a lot of other dimensions related to those technologies and planning for those technologies, but here we're going to look specifically at how the representation can be improved in long-term scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, we can try to define a bit more the methodology that's usually used. What do we mean by modeling tools, scenarios, and long-term planning in this context? And so this shows a schematic view of how we see the linkages between these three elements based on work actually done in the long-term energy scenarios campaign. And typically, if you want to look at it, the birth of a policy in regards to energy or variable renewable energy deployment is supported by typically scenarios that are developed in turn most of the time by a set of modeling tools. And throughout this entire process, stakeholder consultations across the three elements are critical and key parts of the process. And one thing to highlight in these three elements is that typically the use of scenarios and the use of modeling tools are actually separate processes in this chain. While maybe in an academic environment, the use of modeling, production of scenarios, and then use of scenario results to form insights is maybe one coherent process. In practical applications, national policy making, we often see these are separate processes performed many times by different people or different institutions. However, for the clean energy transition, if we're looking to actually go toward the future of changing the system as a whole, each of these is highly relevant. And so it's important to, if we look at the next slide, see some of the issues that do come up. And for variable renewable energy, this can actually be a problem, the fact that these processes are often separate in planning. Since those who work extensively with long-term expansion models know that when it comes to variable renewable energy, these models are focused on economic assessment of options. They're also focused on system-wide optimization, and they don't necessarily represent fully operational aspects, or they don't necessarily answer all questions related to energy system or power system reliability. And so energy planning officials, who are the ones that typically use long-term expansion models and are planning long-term deployment of variable renewable energy, often get caught in the middle of two different ideas. One potentially from the higher levels of the government, where they say deploying VRE is beneficial and we should adopt ambitious long-term targets. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there could be system operators who on the ground have a perspective that VRE short-term variability could endanger power system reliability, or there's actually an upper limit of how much VRE of wind and solar we can integrate into our system. And so this is a problem that was actually continually coming up at IRENA. And so if we go to the next slide, there was a project that was initiated, the Addressing Variable Renewables in Long-Term Planning project. And it resulted in the publication you see here, Planning for the Renewable Future, released in 2017. And this is just based on an extensive consultation with experts at all three stages that were just discussed. So that's system operators, energy planning officials, and government officials, to better understand how processes can be linked, how renewable energy, especially variable renewable energy, can be better represented in long-term models, to make these discussions a bit easier and to make their representation a bit more accurate and useful to determine insights. And so if we go to the next slide, what the report started with was just an overview of typical application of planning tools. Let's take a look here without the inclusion of variable renewable energy. And so what you see is just a chart in which from the high level, this is a model with potentially lower detail, but a wider scope. And that flows down to other models which go into more detail, but then as they do that, they narrow the scope of analysis. And so starting from the top, we have generation capacity expansion models, which typically have a less granular time resolution. And those normally produce generation and network capacities into the future. So a long-term look at what generation and network capacities could look like. And those, in the next step, are normally fed into geospatial planning models, which look more at the network topology, where things in transmission networks might be located and what is needed to expand the transmission networks themselves. And so once you have sort of a generation and transmission capacity, then we get into a type of model which I think Emanuele will go into more detail in the next presentation. These are the dispatch models, which have resolution more on the scale of minutes to hours. And they produce highly resolved dispatch and operational details for the power system. And then normally, in a lot of situations, we see that those results are passed on to potentially another team or another institution, a utility, for example, that might look at static grid models and dynamic grid models to assess how the power system can respond at time resolution, which is really could be milliseconds to minutes. And this is more in terms of electricity studies rather than economic analysis into the long term, something like 20 to 40 years. But important changes happen when you introduce variable renewable energy into this process. And so if we go to the next slide, what we see here is that there are some features in wind and solar PV, for example, that are unique. And those properties have unique impacts on the system as a whole, the power system, and in turn that has impacts on the different planning stages. And so for VRE, such as wind and solar, what we can say the first sort of unique property that we see is that they're non-synchronous, which means that they don't necessarily have the large spinning, rotating mass of a gas plant or a thermal plant that actually provides what's called inertia in the power system that currently is used to address frequency and voltage response, which are just electrical terms. And these are actually important when we're looking at technical network studies and even geospatial planning to some extent. The next unique property of variable renewable energy, of course, for solar and wind resource, these are actually going to be location constrained. There's certain locations which have better wind and solar resources than others, and they're also distributed, which means that they're not necessarily centralized as a thermal plant would be. And these have implications for the system in terms of not only transmission capacity where they're sited, but also voltage control due to the distances of transmission lines themselves. And that also has impact on the technical network studies and where you're planning to put your transmission lines. And then a third unique property, wind and solar, they're not necessarily certain in terms of generation. For example, from day to day, the forecast for winds and solar could be off by a certain amount. And this has implications for flexibility needs. And those flexibility needs are normally determined in a dispatch simulation. And so that has to be taken into account as well. But that uncertainty could also affect your technical network studies in terms of how many quick, fast-acting reserves you might need in the system to meet some, let's say, a missed forecast at a short term. And then the final kind of unique property of VRE is that they are variable, of course, in the name. So it's not necessarily the case that wind and solar will be producing at their full capacity at all times, and they depend on the resource itself. And then this has implication for flexibility needs, but also firm capacity provision. And that just simply means how much of a potential wind or solar plant, how much of that capacity can be relied upon to statistically provide a certain amount at a certain time to meet demand. More or less, how much can we really expect to be guaranteed looking into the future that will be available at a certain time to meet demand. And this is something that needs to be put on an additional consideration in generation expansion planning. So if we go to the next slide, what the study then looks at is in terms of actual investments from a long-term perspective, which of these properties, let's say, is the most important? What is the priority that we need to consider these in long-term planning? Because we can't necessarily do everything in a long-term study using a long-term model. And so what we see here are two dimensions of power systems, generation and the power system networks, and then two key dimensions of planning. So system adequacy, making sure that there's enough capacity on the system to meet demand at all times, and then security of operation, meaning that the power system can respond to disturbances or variable operation, whether it's changes in demand or changes in the variable renewable energy supply. And so based on consultation with experts and then sort of surveys of users of these models, what was found was that firm capacity was determined to be really the most relevant in terms of the complementary investments that you might have to make when you're planning for variable renewable energy in the future. And so that simply means if you don't have a certain amount of capacity on the system that you expect, there is a significant amount of investment you might need to make in complementary capacity to make up for that. And also for high relevance was determined that flexibility and transmission capacity are important qualities to consider in long-term models. This could mean additional resources in terms of flexible generation, demand-side response on the flexibility side, and then transmission capacity. If you're not planning for a significant expansion of transmission to meet where the variable renewable energy is, then this could entail large investments in the future based on transmission. And so the other sort of two components, which is voltage control capability and stability, which is made up of more frequency response and voltage response, were more determined to have near-term relevance. So these could typically be met by relatively less costly measures with less lead time. So not necessarily having to plan 20 or 40 years in advance to provide voltage control or stability. And now, of course, if you see stability, this can be system specific. So in an island setting, for example, stability actually needs to be planned very carefully. And this is something that could be discussed more. So if we go to the next slide, what we see is the same picture that we looked at earlier, but what it could potentially look like with long-term energy planning with VRE. And so in general, it does look a little bit more complicated, but what we see as important is that we have feedback now from these different levels. So it's not necessarily that we're just performing long-term generation expansion studies, looking 20 to 40 years in the future at only generation, but we want to take into consideration how much a new transmission line might cost, how much new flexibility measures could cost, how much transmission enhancement might be needed, and how much stability the system would have. And those, as mentioned before, have decreasing priority as you go down the list, but it's always going to be important to consider these at some point in the planning process. And if we go to the next slide, how can we actually do it? First, and probably most importantly, is to have a better coordination in the planning process across different planning bodies. So no longer have, let's say, a siloed modeling or analysis done in a utility versus the government's planning agency versus policymaker, is really to better coordinate across those entities. And then from the methodological side, there are many ways which are cataloged in the report that I mentioned in order to improve the actual modeling of variable renewable energy, such as wind and solar, that can be used across the spectrum, and those can be incorporated. And if this can be done from the beginning, that would definitely be the way to go. But it's never too late to start including these into your analysis. And maybe just to note, before we move to the next presentation, is that based on additional conversations we've had and engagement with our member states at IRENA, one of the best practices that we've seen is that really you may have to end up using multiple models to validate results, a suite of models to tackle different questions. And one of these examples, maybe an example of this, is that IRENA developed a tool to validate the flexibility aspect, the flexibility measures that might be needed based on capacity expansion plans. And that's something that I believe Emanuele will discuss next. So that's all we have on this presentation. Thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your presentation. Indeed, it was very interesting. We do have some questions coming in, and we would like to address them to you. The first question is regarding you showed in slide 2 that for one in the one side the government has a discourse on promoting renewables, while people on the ground, to say TSOs, are pushing back because they fear the system will have troubles to have that higher shares of renewables. So the question is, if the TSOs have already dispatched models for the system in which they do assessments, why do we need to still push forward with other types of models and link them to the expansion models? If they are already having the models, why do we have to push forward on that sense, or what needs to be done to the threshold that TSO usually grid operators are putting?
So if I think I understand the questions. If it's essentially why do we need to have the linkage if work is already being done? One of the slides I had at the end is this feedback from different levels, and what that really is about is taking the perspective of the long-term expansion models, which are meant to assess economic feasibility of different capacity expansion plans. And so each of these steps underneath, so let's say utility is conducting stability assessment using a more detailed model, each of the solutions those more detailed studies might recommend actually has an economic cost that may not be considered in the long-term capacity expansion plan. And so in a way, if you want to think about it, that there could be hidden costs in each of these subsequent steps after you conduct a long-term study. And it's more about making sure that you're not making decisions based on an incomplete picture of what those costs could be. And so typically those costs range, they differ in a range, and that's kind of the idea between the prioritization that we discussed here, is that the flexibility costs and maybe big transmission investments, as well as providing complementary capacities to back up wind and solar generation, are going to usually be the highest cost items. And so connecting processes and different models that actually define those costs, it's important to then go back to your long-term plan and see if that would actually make a big difference in which decisions you'd make, which investments you'd make for the next 20 to 40 years or so.
Thank you, Daniel. Talking about hidden costs, we have a question that might relate to that. It says, if you could please comment on the aspects of the initial conditions, investments not amortized, and existing contracts with generators, which will eventually affect in the future blocks of renewable energies that will be built tendered, and how to insert distributed generation into the scenarios, solar roofs in homes and industries, and storage possibilities, and super batteries. Maybe in which stage of the planning should these things be considered?
So maybe if I can address the first question, which which seemed to be about sort of aspects outside that may not be considered. I think when we're looking at these long-term models, we call them techno-economic analyses. So what the real detail is on the technical performance and the economics of the operation of the investment in the different technologies. And so issues such as potentially contracts, other agreements with governments, and how those evolve over time. It may not be always the case that those are considered in most long-term analyses, but there are various ways to, of course, incorporate them as somewhat of a proxy into a long-term model. Say you can vary the cost based on what you know about certain contracts. You can vary the lifetime of certain technologies based on contracts. But again, it depends on the case, whether you'd like to do that within the modeling itself or whether you'd like to do it after the fact knowing what you know about the technical and economic performance of an optimized system. And then the second question was about distributed generation, where to include that. And I think ideally what we would say, and I think the next presentation is going to be really good for this question, is that ideally we would include it everywhere if we could. But the fact that distributed generation and storage are such so dependent on their detailed operation and their detailed, let's say, temporal resolution and geospatial resolution, the fact is that most of the analysis involved in those two aspects happens in this sort of production cost modeling on an hourly basis. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about in the next presentation. Yeah.
Daniel, before you finish, just one more question that has just two more questions actually. The first question is, who should be responsible for coordination of all modeling teams? I think this refers to all the modeling chain that you showed, right?
Yeah, okay.
Now, first question, and the very last question to you is, what is the definition of flexibility used? What do you understand by flexibility? Can you expand a bit more on this?
Okay, sure. So for the first question, that's I don't think it's possible to really be prescriptive on who exactly should be, especially generalizing, but there are good practices actually from this long-term energy scenarios campaign that are being released about how different governments, different planning agencies work together to coordinate their modeling, their assumptions, and their assessment of the different insights. I believe that some of the long-term energy scenarios work there were a few webinars on how that could be done. And so it will vary depending on the context, depending on who has jurisdiction to convene different stakeholders, or who has jurisdiction to ask for data, share data, especially. Sharing data is sometimes very difficult depending on the location. So it varies, but there are good practices. Typically, it just involves more communication, not necessarily done from sort of a centralized actor, but across the board. And that's something I think people are actually still working on in most contexts, how to get that right and how to best do that. For the flexibility question, I think gladly point to the next presentation, which I believe has the definition of what we're talking about when we talk about flexibility.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was Daniel Russo from IRENA Innovation Technology Center. And now we're going to pass to our second speaker for today, Emanuele Taibi, who will be speaking about power system flexibility for the energy transition. Emanuele, welcome.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emanuele Taibi. I will be starting where Daniel just left. So if you allow me, I'll just give you the definition that we put forward in our report on power system flexibility published in November last year, which is the flexibility is the capability of a power system to cope with the variability and uncertainty that VRE generation introduces into the system at different time scales, from very short to very long term, avoiding curtailment of variable renewables and reliably supplying all the demanded energy to customers. Now, there are several other definitions in the report that we're quoting. So depending on the angle you are taking, you can look at flexibility from different perspectives. Some people include stability, some people include adequacy. From our starting point, we are really looking at how to decarbonize the power system. And therefore, our point is to see how much VRE the system can take. And to be able to take more VRE, you need to increase the flexibility. And my presentation will be touching upon some of these aspects and how you can model that as a follow-up activity from the long-term capacity expansion plan modeling. So, presentation will be split into three parts, not necessarily strongly separated, but to give it a continuum, we will start from the more general aspects of flexibility. Then we're going to look at flexibility and its role in the energy transition, and how do we see it as part of the work we do with our colleagues that look at long-term capacity expansion planning. and with governments that look at the flexibility of their plans. And then finally, we're going to say a few words about an open source model that we developed together with the VTT Research Center of Finland, and that is available for download on IRENA's website since November. So this is the definition I read as an answer to the previous question. And essentially, the main point we want to make to policymakers when we discuss flexibility is that in the past, we had storage in the form of fossil fuels, and we had a non-controllable load, and supply was trying to match the usage of the fuel with the variability of the demand. And this was all taken care of by generation and to a certain extent transmission. This is now changing. So large shares of variable renewables, as Daniel explained, introduce variability and uncertainty at a higher level than before. And the important element is that flexibility should be optimized as well. So a least cost mix of flexibility options should be leveraged throughout the system. So this can include, of course, supply side. It will definitely include transmission, but should also include distribution. There was a question about the role of distributed assets in long-term planning. Storage, both behind the meter utility scale and making better use of hydropower storage. And the role of demand, which is a significant source of flexibility that so far has been mostly untapped. The additional element that we cover in our work is the so-called sector coupling. So how increasing electrification of heat, electrification of transport, and electrification of fuels can add to the power system flexibility, and at the same time helping decarbonizing the power system. So one slide that I will just touch upon very briefly, but to give a flavor of why do we use different types of models. Well, long-term capacity expansion models and dispatch models are both optimization models. They both have an objective function to be minimized under certain constraints. So in theory, if you didn't have computational constraints, say maybe with future quantum computers, you might have an objective function that takes into account all these aspects and all the constraints. Or maybe we can find new approaches to solving such complex problems by learning from historical data on operations that become more and more abundant. There are platforms now that help in sharing this information in the public domain, like the ENTSO e-transparency platform, for instance. And leveraging this new large amount of data could allow for, say, deep learning techniques to solve these problems in a much more efficient way as a single problem. But to date, we still need to break down the problem into different steps. And a very important reason for that was highlighted in one of the questions. We do have different stakeholders doing different parts of the planning work. The important aspect in linking these different stakeholders is that you build a dialogue and try to, let's say, reduce the tension between, let's say, very pro-renewable policies and operational constraints that might limit the penetration of renewables. So moving from constraints that look at the very short-term operations into which investments can be included into the long-term plan to increase flexibility and relax such constraints is a very important conversation to be having at this stage in the energy transition. Another aspect is the time scale. Daniel also touched upon that, so I will not spend much time. But in short, there are a set of constraints that really need to be taken into account carefully as we increase the share of variable renewables, and dispatch models are best placed to take them into account. And therefore, linking these two models would be a very good starting point. This is what we do also at IRENA. We take long-term scenarios from member countries or from some of our colleagues that look at the 2030 and 2050 timeframe and try to refine the power system part by looking at some of the constraints that would emerge as binding as the share of variable renewable increases. And this is by no means a comprehensive discussion on the topic, for which I suggest, for instance, one paper that might be worthwhile reading to learn a bit more about all the different methodologies to treat such issues about soft linking and hard linking of models. Getting much more practical, this is an example using our IRENA Flex tool, which I will introduce next, in which a constraint that is typically not taken into account into a long-term plan could reduce utilization of variable renewables by curtailing them. And in this specific case, is a system with limited ramping capability from thermal units that is not able to increase the output from thermal units when the sun goes down, and therefore ends up curtailing significant amount of solar PV. In this case, you run an investment phase into the flex tool, so somehow a mini capacity expansion for expanding flexibility, and by deploying cost-effective amount of battery storage, this curtailment is mostly eliminated, as battery storage can contribute significantly to the ramping capability of the power system. Skipping the slide in the interest of time, where does the flex tool, the IRENA IITC developed, as I mentioned earlier, sit into the planning toolkit? So upper right corner, you see the capacity expansion models for power sector. Below that is the energy planning models that are, let's say, capacity expansion plus non-power investment models, such as message or markup times. In the middle, you have typical dispatch models, and the flex tool is a typical dispatch model, is a linear dispatch model. The interesting element is that it has an expansion component, but with a shorter time horizon. So it's an investment in flexibility. It's not an investment in capacity per se. It could also do that, but it's not a 20-year plan. It's a 1-year assessment of the flexibility in the system and trying to identify potential cost-effective additional investments. And then finally, at very short term, there are grid studies that look at a different approach to the power sector, looking at frequency, voltage, and other elements that are typically not part of optimization models. So it's a different class of models, which is not possible to hard link. You can have some proxy constraint from these models going back into the dispatch, and I'll say a few words about that later. So a few more words about the flex tool. As I mentioned, it's a dispatch tool, and it has a focus on flexibility. When we say flexibility, essentially what we're trying to see is a sufficient time granularity and taking into account all the technical constraints. Is there any loss of load, variable renewable curtailment, spillage of hydro from large hydropower reservoirs, insufficient availability of reserves, or insufficient capacity. So to a certain extent, we're also looking at generation adequacy here. And as an additional element, this tool is able to do an investment phase to address these issues. Each of them comes with a penalty, and based on the value of the penalty, there will be a different amount of investment in solutions that could be generation, transmission, storage, or flexibility on the demand side, including sector coupling, that could reduce this lack of flexibility. And then you can go back and redispatch the system and see if this has been resolved. So the usage of the tool, 3 steps. First of all, assessing the flexibility of a plan. So taking as an input a capacity expansion plan, looking at the flexibility in more detail. Second is to identify cost-efficient additional investments. And finally, run a sensitivity analysis and see how much you can push additional VRE into the system before you experience flexibility issues. This is very relevant, especially for distributed generation, because it might not be a result of a planned set of investment. It might be a consumer decision, or for electric vehicles, which is also a consumer decision. So essentially, you might indeed get much more solar PV than you have in your plan because consumers decide to deploy that. And so you would have to see through this additional phase what would be the impact on the system. So these 3 phases, 3 examples from application of the flex tool. First of all, the flexibility assessment, which is the core purpose of the flex tool. This is one of the results from the Uruguay case study, which is also available on IRENA website. Uruguay has a significant amount of hydropower and a very large share of wind. And we look at some of the more challenging days where the load is low and wind is generating a significant amount of the power during the day. And what would that mean in terms of flexibility? And in this specific case, you see that if you would have a cross-active cross-border active market with the neighboring countries, the transmission capacity with the neighbors is sufficient to take any excess energy, or sector coupling could be the second best in this case. But overall, in the year, there is a significant ability of following the generation of variable renewables through hydropower. Second case, where we look at cost-effective additional investments, we start from a plan with a significant share of renewables, and we see through a capacity expansion phase if there is any residual potential for investments that would reduce system cost. And this, you see it on the left-hand side, there is potential for additional PV. On the right-hand side, you see what that means. So typically investments in solar and wind, or investment in flexibility options such as storage, transmission, or low capacity factor flexible generation, increase the capex of the system, so the annuity, but at the same time they reduce the OPEX. And so cost-effective investments in this case are typically increasing the capex less than they are decreasing the OPEX. So this chart shows one of such cases. The objective of the tool is to minimize total system cost, which is the sum of capex and OPEX. And then finally, and I'm getting to the end of my presentation, pushing more variable renewables into the system, what does it mean for flexibility? So you have here, starting from the bottom left, the reference scenario where there's no flexibility issue. And then there is a cost-effective amount of curtailment, as you can see. So the additional share of variable renewables comes with almost 1% curtailment, and that is economically efficient. So curtailment is not to be avoided at all costs. There is an amount of curtailment that is part of the economical solution, and that has to be assessed carefully, which is difficult to do with a long-term capacity expansion model. That's why you need a more granular model. Going beyond the optimal amount of renewables in the system, you can push more PV and see what happens to curtailment, and identify when additional solutions might become cost-effective. In this case, we show how battery storage is deployed to reduce curtailment. In the case which, for instance, consumer decide to install additional 2 gigawatt of PV, and in the most upper right case, you have 2.5 gigawatt of PV and 2.5 gigawatt of wind. This increases rapidly curtailment because you're hitting your flexibility limits, and that's where battery storage becomes cost effective. So in conclusion, 5 points here. The steep decrease in the cost of renewables, together with the drive for decarbonization of the energy system, are by nature deploying more variable renewable energy into the power sector. IRENA's analysis estimates that 85% of electricity generation at least should be from renewables in 2050, and that overall the power sector is fed by 2/3 from solar and wind. And this is a significant amount because this 2/3 is an average. Once you start looking at the most challenging hours of the year in the most, let's say, VRE dependent countries, this becomes very significant, and that's why you need to look at your plans at a much more granular level. Variability and uncertainty require, at one point, changes in the power system. This is not true at low shares, but at high shares, this is definitely the case. But this could be done at least cost. And the important point that we're trying to make is that a mix of solutions on supply, on the grid, and on demand side need to be leveraged to make sure that this is done at least cost. And first of all, operations is a no-brainer first step where flexibility should be leveraged before we look at investments. Third point, and I think I already mentioned that in the second point, but beyond that, sector coupling is a potentially very significant source of flexibility, and if not managed carefully, is actually a potential source of adequacy challenges. So it is a challenge, but is something you can turn into an opportunity, as more demand for electricity means more potential for variable renewables to be deployed. Fourth, we saw a gap in this space where long-term capacity expansion tools that are mostly open source didn't really have a dispatch equivalent. Therefore, we work with the VTT Research Center to develop an open source tool. This is available already since November on IRENA's website. A new version is coming soon with even more features, and this takes into account as many technical constraints as possible to date into the dispatch, and this is being used already with 4 IRENA member countries, and 2 large regional studies are in the pipeline. And then finally, IRENA is working bilaterally with a few more member countries to do this analysis of their long-term plan and try to suggest a least cost mix of additional flexibility investments that would be worthwhile considering. So with this, I'm happy to take any question you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emanuele, for that presentation. Indeed, as well, very interesting. We do have some questions that have come in. The first question is, Uruguay has, it's a comment and a question. Uruguay has the advantage of supports from its neighbors, Brazil and Argentina, through its interconnections. The same happens with Honduras and Nicaragua. The support is given by Guatemala and Costa Rica. Could you please comment especially about the experience of IRENA in the clean energy corridors and maybe how this tool can be implemented or used to assess these cases?
Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, this is a perfect question, as the first regional work that we're going to do is part of the Central America Clean Energy Corridor. So we are working together with, of course, all the stakeholders in Central America, and we had discussion with all the member countries during our assembly, so back in January, on how to go about this. So we are ready to start this project. This will include a long-term component through the REMAP process, directly and jointly developed with the flexibility assessment. And therefore, the flexibility assessment will look at the flexibility in the countries, but also cross-border. And by doing that, show the value of regional cooperation in a quantitative way. So beyond the notional understanding that this is important, we will show in dollars what does it mean in terms of potential savings for the system as a region.
Thanks, Emanuele, for that answer. Another question that has come in is, how often do you think performing a flexibility assessment would significantly change the long-term capacity expansion plan?
It really depends on how flexible is your system to start with. So in systems that have well-developed transmission capacity without congestion being a frequent issue, and significant hydropower capacity, this typically is not a major issue. It is mostly about where do you locate variable renewables, and if there is enough transmission capacity to get hydro, variable renewables, and load to, let's say, connect to each other at every hour of the year. In systems with more inflexible generation or inflexible operations, this is something that needs to be carefully looked at. So every time there is a new version of the long-term plan, it would be good to have directly an assessment of that plan through a flexibility assessment and identify any additional measures either in the operations or in the investment phase that should be considered in the long-term plan. And as I was showing in the chart before, loop the two until the dispatch clears without significant issues on, say, curtailment of the load.
Thank you. We have a couple of more questions, if that's fine, Emanuele. Some interesting ones that are coming in. One says some countries set renewable targets on certain percentage based on political will, without first ascertaining the technical impacts on grid. Does IRENA have a structured methodology to help countries assess the readiness for a grid integration of VRE?
Thank you very much. I think there was a very nice slide from Daniel that was showing the process. So I think from my experience working at IRENA with member countries, I say that the number one value here is not linking the model, but linking the people. So to have a conversation with all the stakeholders about how do we go about the plan, what are the opportunities that people see, and which challenges should be addressed. So first of all, there's the dialogue between the different stakeholders, especially at the national level, which is somehow often in need for being bridged across different timescales. So a very long-term plan doesn't have to be concerned about a must run that you might see because of stability issues in the operations tomorrow. It might be wanting to take such concerns at the grid level back into the dispatch and from the dispatch back into the plant, so that instead of saying running a must run on your coal units, you might invest in synchronous condensers and more transmission and some battery storage, and turn off these coal units at all, and allow therefore a much better operation of the system with the high level political targets that are put forward.
Okay, and one last question that for Emanuele is, for the case studies you presented, what sector couplings were assessed using the FLEX tool? And finally, will you have a class at IRENA for the FLEX tool developed by VGT Research?
Thank you. So on the specific case studies we've shown, I think I only shown one slide from the case studies. This was more about the tool than the case studies. There was no sector coupling being considered yet, because the government is considering that as a result of the assessment. So they're taking a look at what can be done, for instance, in terms of electric vehicles. What we've done with the tool is that we try to incorporate all the possible technical constraints. So we have system non-synchronous penetration constraints, reserves constraints, of course, ramping constraints, and now in the new version we will have even inertia constraints and even getting more technical on such issues. And at the same time, when it comes to sector coupling, we have already modules of the tool ready that you download together with the tool. If you go on the website now, you will find there electric vehicles, power to heat, and essentially it's all ready to go, provided you have the information about the sector coupling options you want to consider. There was another part of the question that
yes, if there's going to be a class or training.
So there might be an opportunity definitely to get more into the details through webinars, but definitely we are going to do that as part of the regional work. So we will have trainings in Central America, we will have another training in the Caribbean, and we will have most likely a training in Southeast Asia. And this is what we have, let's say, visibility on at the moment. This is what we know is confirmed. Definitely, if there is a need for more, please get in touch with us and we can discuss.
Well, thank you very much. We want to thank today's presenters and hope that the insights they have shared have been of great value to all our audience. Thank you all for tuning into this IRENA webinar series on the long-term energy scenarios for the clean energy transition. Until next time.